is officially spooky season, and that means today is the launch day for Zack's book, Ghost of Gravsmith. If you haven't pre-ordered it yet, find the link in the description and probably more than likely in the pinned comment as well to go order the book on Kindle, paperback, and I believe there's a hardback version as well. So please go support him. And by supporting him, you're supporting me. At the same time, if you're a bookworm and you like creepy stuff, which I know most of you obviously do because that's why you're here, go support him and support me by supporting him. And also, I got new merch. I got hoodies and crew necks, and each order, whether you order a hoodie or whether you order a crew neck, will come with a sticker pack of 3 stickers along with a window decal as well. I did try on both of them, and I would say if you like your crew necks kind of like baggy like I do, I would probably go a size up. Hoodies should be totally fine. They fit pretty well, and they're a little bit baggy, so they fit pretty perfectly. Really stoked about the orange. I liked how the orange hoodies came out. Well, both of them for the most part. But anyway, yeah, go get comfy and cozy for spooky season and support me as well. All of this can be found on my official website, which will also be in the pinned comment and in the description of the video. All right, that's it. That's all. Enjoy the stories. It's spooky season, guys. It's been a few years now, but I think about the place sometimes. Not in the way you might recall an old apartment or a temporary living situation, but more like a nightmare that gets under your skin and just refuses to leave. I was at a low point in my life, fresh off a breakup with my girlfriend at the time. The split itself had been rough, one of those long, drawn-out, ugly things where everybody we knew had to pick sides. It wasn't just her and me breaking up. It felt like half of our social circle was now breaking apart too. When you know it, most of our mutual friends gravitated toward her. I guess I wasn't great company back then. Either way, I had to move out fast. The lease was up on the place that we shared, and I didn't want to stick around long enough to get tangled up in any more drama. The problem was, though, most of my friends were either full up with roommates or not exactly eager to take on somebody carrying a lot of emotional baggage. That's when I turned to the internet. It felt like a roll of the dice, but I was desperate, and at the time there was no other options. After scrolling through a few people that seemed either too expensive or too sketchy, I found this listing that seemed perfect. A guy named Mason was renting out a room in his house. The price was almost too good to be true. The location was ideal, and the house, based on the pictures, looked pretty well kept. It was somewhat common to make connections on the web back then. You could actually go on social media or Craigslist and find halfway decent living situations. Figured I had nothing to lose, so I took his info down. When I reached out, Mason responded almost immediately. We set up a time for me to come by and check out the place. There was something oddly formal about the whole thing. He wanted to do a brief interview. Nothing too intense, but enough to make sure I was the right fit. Honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted out of my ex's place. So I drove over to Mason's house later that week, nervous but eager. I was actually kind of stoked to live with an older dude, like an uncle or something like that. Plus, hopefully, we might have some things in common we could talk about or even do together. The house itself was even better than I expected. A 2-story place in this quiet neighborhood, tucked back from the road with this well-manicured lawn, and the front porch looking like something out of a real estate ad. Mason answered the door almost immediately, like he'd been standing behind it, waiting. He was tall, thin, and had this pale, almost waxy complexion. And then he had short brown hair that looked like it hadn't been combed in at least 25 years. His smile was too wide, his handshake too firm. He seemed nice enough though, just a little intense, but I could handle that. Still, there was something just underneath the surface that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He showed me around and I couldn't help but be completely impressed. The room was small but comfortable, plenty of light and a view of the backyard. The whole place was super clean, almost sterile clean. like Mason spent most of his time making sure everything was just right. As he was giving me the tour, he mentioned to me that he'd come into a pretty large inheritance from a few years back and didn't really need to work full-time anymore. He had a part-time gig at an engineering firm, but spent most of his free time volunteering at his local church. The way he said it, though, about volunteering like it was the most important thing in his life, for some reason just gave me this pause, but who was I to judge him? A few days later, I move in. At first, it was a pretty great arrangement. Mason kept to himself most of the time. I'd see him in the mornings when he was heading out for work or for church, and sometimes occasionally in the evening. We didn't really talk much, just the usual pleasantries. I noticed he didn't seem to have too many friends coming by, which struck me as odd for a guy who spent so much time in the community. But again, I didn't put too much stock in it. I was just relieved to have my own space finally. I'd say it wasn't about until a week later that things started to get weird. It was a Friday night. I had a long week at work. I picked up a 6-pack on the way home, planning to relax with a beer or two before heading to bed. I was sitting in the living room, sipping at my first beer, flipping through the channels, when Mason walked in. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw that bottle. His face immediately twisted into something that I can really only describe as pure, unfiltered rage. "What are you doing?" he snapped, his voice low but trembling with anger. He had all the energy of a pissed-off stepfather. I stared back at him, confused. Just having a beer? In my house? You're drinking in my house." His voice rose with each word until he was practically screaming. "Do you have any idea how disgusting that is? How vile?" I blinked, completely caught off guard. "It's just a beer, man. I didn't think." "That's the problem. You didn't think." He stormed over and snatched the bottle right out of my hand and slammed it down on the coffee table so hard I thought the glass was about to shatter. "This is a Christian home. Alcohol is a sin. I will not have it here. You're poisoning yourself. And worse, you're poisoning my house." His face was bright red, hands shaking. I could not believe what I was hearing. I knew some people had strong feelings about alcohol, but this was something else entirely. "Okay, all right, it's your house. I'll get rid of it," I said, trying to calm him down. I grabbed the bottle and headed for the kitchen, pouring the beer down the sink. I felt his eyes on me that whole time, like he was making sure I didn't take another sip. When I finished, I turned to face him, raising my hands in surrender. "It's gone. I will not bring any more into the house, okay?" Mason just stared at me for a long moment before he finally nodded. "Good. See that you don't." I retreated back to my room after that, feeling like I just narrowly avoided some kind of disaster. I ended up just leaving the house for the night, headed to a bar to clear my head. I stayed out late, got drunk, and when I finally stumbled home, Mason was already asleep, or at least his bedroom door was closed and the house was dark. I crashed on my bed, hoping the whole thing would blow over by morning. It didn't. The next few days were tense, to say the least. Mason barely even spoke to me, and when he did, it was curt and cold. I just tried to stay out of his way, but it was hard to not feel like I was being watched. Every time I walked into a room, I could feel his eyes right on me, judging, waiting for me to screw up again. All of it was pretty crazy, as the guy had never mentioned anything about maintaining a dry household. Definitely should have put it in his post if it were that important. A few nights later, I decided to push my luck a little. I picked up another 6-pack on my way home from work, but this time, I was a lot more careful. I snuck the beers into my room, drank them in secret, and then made sure to get rid of the evidence. I sat out back on the porch, sipping in the quiet, watching the stars. It felt like I was getting away with something. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. A grown-ass man sneaking beers like a teenager in his own house. I went to bed feeling a little buzzed, but satisfied I'd avoided another confrontation with Mason. That feeling, however, didn't last long. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was soft, almost like whispering. It was coming from the foot of my bed. Groggy and disoriented, I blinked in the darkness, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when I saw him. Mason was standing over me, face inches from mine, sniffing me. He was inhaling deeply, like he was trying to smell the alcohol on my skin, his lips moving as if he whispered something underneath his breath. I couldn't quite make out the words, but it sounded like a prayer. I jerked back instinctively trying to sit up, but my right hand wouldn't move. I looked down and realized with a cold wave of terror that my wrist was zip-tied to the bed frame. Mason, what the hell? I started, but he cut me off, his voice low and menacing. You drank again, didn't you? You defiled this house with your sin. I struggled against the zip tie, heart pounding in my chest. Okay. I'm sorry, I'll leave, all right? I'll leave. I'll move out in the morning, just let me go. Oh, it's too late for that, Mason said. His eyes were wild. His breath was coming in these short gasps. You've been corrupted. You need to be cleansed. He raised his arms up above his head, fingers twitching as he began to chant something in a language that I did not understand. It sounded like scripture, but disoriented, twisted into something dark and just wrong. His face was lit up with this fever, his eyes wide and unblinking. I yanked hard on that zip tie, and by some miracle it snapped. I scrambled out of bed, shoved Mason aside as I bolted for the door. He didn't really try to stop me physically, but he blocked the doorway, still chanting, hands raised in the air like he was performing his own kind of ritual. To this day, the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was almost like he was a puppet on strings. Mason, move! I shouted. But he just stood there. I didn't have it in me to fight him. The guy was technically the landlord, so I didn't think that it would go in my favor. I grabbed my phone and my wallet and threw a few clothes into a bag. Made this split-second decision. Instead of trying to get past him, I opened up the window and just climbed out, dropped into the backyard. My bedroom was on the first floor, so it really wasn't a problem just to crawl right into freedom. I really expected this to be enough for Mason to break character, but he didn't flinch at all. He kept doing that weird dance, kept whispering at me, then just slammed the window behind me after I left. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Part of me expected to come around the front of the house and find Mason standing there, but he wasn't, and he never came out. I called a friend, one of the very few who hadn't sided with my ex. I told him everything. He let me crash at his place that night. And the next morning, I went back to Mason's house with the police. When we arrived, Mason answered the door with this energy I'd never seen. In fact, he almost looked normal now. He showered, shaved, brushed his hair and teeth. Clearly, he'd been expecting us. When the officers explained the situation to him, that I was just there to get my things out of the bedroom, Mason shook his head, as if he had no idea what was going on or what the problem could be. He offered up a bold-faced lie, and it totally worked. I was stunned, how much he had changed just to snake out of the consequence of being completely batshit crazy. He agreed to let me in and pack up my things, and when the officers looked back at me with a nod, Mason gave me this psychotic smirk as if to say, yeah, I fucking got you. It was crazy, but at least I was getting my stuff back, so I just went with it. One of the officers accompanied me through the house, the other one just stayed by the front door. Mason followed us around with an extra creepy facial expression until I was finally done. I didn't say much, neither did he. I didn't want to provoke him again. Then it was just over. I packed up my car, gave the key back to Mason, and I never saw that guy again. Thankfully, found a different place to live for a while and slowly but surely got back on my feet. To this day, I really don't know what happened. Maybe Mason was just one of those religious fanatics who lost his mind in the moment. Or maybe there was something darker going on in that house, something that I can't really explain. All I know is that I got out and haven't looked back since. I was 20 years old when I finally moved out of my parents' house. It took me a lot longer than most of my friends to take that leap. While they were all off to college dorms or roommates in dingy apartments, I continued to linger. Part of me felt like it was just safer staying with my parents. My dad worked construction and my mom was a teacher, so they were pretty used to having me around, even after I graduated from high school. I helped out with things when I could, and I really wasn't in any rush to start paying bills. Jobs were pretty scarce in 2009. It was right after the economic collapse, and I felt like I was just floating around in this weird limbo. My parents didn't really seem to mind though, but I could tell they hoped I'd figure out my next move soon. The opportunity would come knocking from an old family friend. A couple, actually. Kyle and Amy Lenka. They've been close with my parents for as long as I could remember. Every Thanksgiving, every 4th of July, they were there, laughing and drinking, talking about the good old days. Kyle was a pretty big guy, a retired contractor who always had some story to tell. Amy, on the other hand, was quieter, sweet, always asking how I was doing or if I needed anything. They did genuinely seem happy together, but looking back now, I realized how surface level my understanding of them really was. They owned a large 4-bedroom house in a quiet, sleepy neighborhood, but like a lot of people, they were hit hard by the recession. Bills were piling up. Even with Kyle's retirement savings, they needed some kind of extra income. Renting out a room seemed like the perfect solution, but they didn't want just anybody living with them. They were looking for somebody they knew, somebody they could trust. And that's why my parents suggested me. At first, it really felt like a dream come true. I'd finally have my own space, my own room in a nice big house. The rent was cheap, and I could still work my part-time job and start saving up for something more permanent. Kyle and Amy were practically family, so it felt safe. It felt like the right move. My parents were thrilled. "It's a great first step," my dad said. "You're really lucky they're offering this, and you should take it." So that's exactly what I did. Moving was pretty easy. Kyle helped me haul my stuff over one Saturday morning. His truck loaded up with boxes and the few pieces of furniture that I had to my name. Amy had cleaned up the guest room for me. It was nice, bigger than my own room at home, with this big window that looked out over their backyard. There's a sprawling oak tree that cast shade over the lawn. I felt like I was stepping into a different life, like I was finally doing something out on my own. The first few weeks were quiet and almost too comfortable. The house was spacious enough that I had plenty of privacy. I'd come home from work, make myself a sandwich or heat up some leftovers, then just settle in my room to watch TV or play some video games. I rarely saw Amy or Kyle, except in passing. Kyle would spend most of his evenings in the garage, working on his old truck, while Amy, on the other hand, stayed busy with household chores or watching her favorite shows in the living room. They never bothered me. I appreciated the space. It was peaceful. But not long after this, things started to change. I remember the first time I noticed something was off. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I had gotten off work a little early. My shift was cut short. I was looking forward to an afternoon of relaxing before the weekend rush. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Kyle stomping out of the house, his face twisted and frothing with rage. He didn't even see me at first. He was too focused on getting into his truck. He slammed the door hard enough that I heard it from inside my car, then just peeled out of the driveway, tires squealing as he sped down the street. I sat there for a moment staring after him. I've never seen Kyle act like that. He was always the loud, jovial type, the kind of guy who liked to crack jokes and tell stories. But this was a different side of him that I'd never seen. That was pure rage, barely even contained. I didn't know what to make of it, but I figured everybody has a bad day now and then, and maybe something just pissed him off. When I walked inside the house, the air felt heavy. The quiet was no longer the peaceful kind that I'd grown used to. It felt stifling. I could hear soft sobs coming from the living room, and as I rounded the corner, I saw Amy sitting on the couch, her head in her hands crying. "Amy?" I called out. She didn't answer at first, but when she finally looked up, her eyes were red. Her face was streaked with tears. The moment she saw me, she wiped her face quickly and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, hey, I didn't hear you come in. Everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Yeah, I just got off work early. Are you sure you're all right? She waved her hand dismissively, brushing off my concern. Oh, it's just a silly thing, nothing to worry about. How about some lunch? I was just about to make something. I opened up my mouth to ask more, but the way she moved and the way she changed the subject so quickly, it made me stop. I felt like she was steering me away from something that I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't push it, even though every instinct I had was telling me that something was very wrong and off. Instead, I just nodded and let her bustle off to the kitchen. After that, the things inside the house completely shifted. At first, it was just small things, subtle changes in the way Kyle and Amy interacted with each other. I noticed how Kyle started to speak to her. His tone was colder, more condescending. He'd make these little remarks underneath his breath when he passed her. Comments about how she didn't clean well enough or how dinner was late. Amy would just smile and laugh it off. But I noticed the way her hands were trembling when she thought I wasn't looking. The tension inside the house grew and grew, and I found myself just tiptoeing around, trying to avoid both of them. Kyle spent more time drinking in the garage, his beer cans piling up faster than before. It wasn't long after before I started hearing their fights at night. At first, just raised voices, muffled but heated arguments behind closed doors. I could never really make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, frustration, resentment. One night, though, things escalated. I was laying in bed trying to block out the usual sounds of their arguments when something heavy crashed against the wall. The sound echoed through the house, followed by Amy's voice, high-pitched and desperate. Then came thudding footsteps. At first, I thought Kyle had stormed out again, but then I heard it. He didn't leave. He was chasing her. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The thudding, now louder and faster, like a stampede through the house. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Was he hurting her? My stomach churned as I heard another crash, this one closer, followed by a sharp scream. I bolted up out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat that I kept in the corner of my closet. My hands were shaking as I stepped out into the hallway. The hallway was dark. I could hear the sounds of their struggle, though. Amy's sobs and Kyle's heavy breathing, his slurred, angry shouts. They were getting closer. I just stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I could hear them coming toward me, those footsteps now just a few feet away. The wing in the house that I lived in had this long hallway with a couple of turns. I could tell they were just around the corner from me. Suddenly, Amy appeared in the dim light, stumbling down the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She saw me and ran toward me, grabbed my arm with her trembling hands. "Please," she gasped out. "Help me, he's gonna..." Before she could finish, Kyle rounded the corner. He was definitely drunk. His shirt was stained with spilled beer and his face flushed red. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, like he wasn't even fully there anymore. He staggered toward us, using the wall for support as he lurched closer and closer. I didn't think, I just reacted. I raised the bat and swung. The bat connected with his head, and that was that. Kyle crumpled to the floor unconscious, his body hitting the ground like a sack of bricks. For a moment, everything was still, too still. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. But the house, the air itself, almost felt like it was holding its own breath, waiting for something else to snap. Honestly, in that moment, I thought he was dead. Amy was shaking beside me, her hand still clutching my arm. I could feel her pulse racing through her fingertips. I stood there, bat in hand, staring down at Kyle's motionless body. My mind was racing, trying to just catch up to what all just happened. Then, to my relief, I saw the old man stir and start to grumble aloud. I'd knocked him out, and I'd knocked him out cold. "Oh my God," Amy whispered. What do we do?" I blinked and shaked myself out of the daze. We need to call the cops, now." Amy nodded, but she didn't move. She was still staring down at Kyle, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed 911. The operator answered quickly. I stammered through the explanation, telling her what happened and where we were. She told me to stay on the line until the police arrived, but I could no longer focus on her voice. All I could think about was Kyle. What if he woke up? What if he wasn't out for much longer? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, we heard the sounds of sirens filling the air. I could see flashing lights through the windows, the red and blue glow reflecting off the walls. 2 police officers burst through the front door, guns drawn. I quickly dropped the bat and raised my hands to show that I was not a threat. Amy collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably as the officers cuffed Kyle's wrists and moved him to a corner. All the while, he was shouting at everybody to get out of his house. I gave my statement, explained everything that had happened, at least on my end, but it felt like a big blur, like I was almost watching it from outside of myself. As they took Kyle away, one of the officers approached me. His face was grim. "You did the right thing, kid," he said. "This is not the first time we've been called out to this house." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I've been living there for a few months, completely oblivious to what was happening right underneath my nose. I'd known something was wrong, but I hadn't done anything about it until it was almost too late. A few years ago, I found myself inside a situation that seemed perfect. Well, at first. I've been living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with a couple whose relationship was hanging on barely even by a thread. The tension between them had turned the air very toxic. Every day was filled with the sounds of their fights. Raised voices, doors slamming, crashing of dishes. I could barely sleep, let alone relax. My days became long stretches of white-knuckled patience, and it got to the point where I was just dreading going home. I knew I had to get out of there before I lost my mind completely. That's when I got a text from Reese, one of my best friends since we were kids. We hadn't been super close in recent years, and just, life had pulled us in different directions. But when we reconnected, it was as if no time passed at all. Reese had found a house, a big one at that, and needed a roommate. He knew I was desperate to leave my current situation, so he offered up a lifeline. He needed somebody to help with the rent, and more importantly, co-sign on the lease. It sounded like an answer to my prayers. Reese was super laid back, easy to get along with. The idea of living with somebody that I trusted in a big, beautiful house seemed like an oasis after the nightmare that I was currently living in. I didn't hesitate. I told him, I'm in. Within a week, we were both moving into the new place. It was everything you could want in a rental. 2-story house with plenty of space, located in the heart of the city. The living room had this massive fireplace. The kitchen had recently been remodeled. And there was a yard big enough for a fire pit and a garage where I could finally work on my car. The neighborhood was quiet but close to everything, to the bars, restaurants, even a nearby park. We both had our own separate rooms, and there was more than enough space for us to stretch out without getting in each other's way. Those first few weeks were just perfect. Reese and I fell back into the easy rhythm of our old friendship. Most evenings we just hang out, either watching movies or playing video games together. On weekends we'd hit up the local bars or just stay home and get drunk, reminiscing about the old days. The house felt like our fortress, a sanctuary that we carved out for ourselves. After the hell that I've been living through, this is exactly what I needed. The first signs of trouble were so subtle that I almost didn't even notice them. It was just small things. Maurice began staying out way later than normal, coming home after midnight when normally he'd be in by 10. He'd roll in smelling like beers and cigarettes, but he'd be quiet about it, so again, I didn't really think much of it. We both had our own lives to live after all. But then it very quickly became a regular thing. He would disappear for hours, not just on weekends, but during the week as well. Sometimes I'd go days without seeing him, just occasionally hear him come in at night and crash into his room without a word. Finally, I asked him about it one evening. We were both home for once, sitting in the living room with beers in hand. Reese seemed to be more distant than usual, his attention fixed on his phone, as I was flipping through the channels on the TV. You've been staying out a lot lately, man, I said, trying to keep my tone light, like it wasn't a big deal. Reese glanced up from his phone. Yeah, I've been hanging out at a bar down the street, met some cool people there. I nodded, took a sip of my beer. You been going there a lot? He shrugged. Yeah, it's a pretty nice spot, good crowd too. I didn't push it. Everybody needed their space, their downtime. And it really wasn't like Reese was doing anything wrong. He was just blowing off steam, like we all would do. I let it go. Figured things would go back to normal eventually. But they didn't. In fact, things got much, much worse. Reese would come home later and later, and when he did, he was usually completely wasted. He'd stumble into the house, barely able to walk straight, crash in his room without saying a word. Sometimes I'd hear him throwing up in the bathroom in the middle of the night or knocking over furniture as he tried to navigate his way back to bed. It was actually starting to get on my nerves, but I still didn't say anything. I didn't really want to be that guy, you know, the uptight roommate who couldn't handle a little partying. Then came that Friday night, and I remember it vividly, every detail burned into my memory. I'd worked pretty late that night, staying at our office to finish up a project. By the time I finally left, it was already dark outside. I was exhausted, looking forward to getting home and just crashing in front of the TV with a beer. Once I turned onto our street, I noticed something odd. Cars were parked all along the road, both sides lined as far as I could see. Our neighborhood was usually quiet, with most people parking in their driveways, so it definitely struck me as strange. I pulled into our street, my stomach sinking as I got closer to our house. The driveway was packed, completely full, no space left for me to park. There were people outside, milling around the front yard, laughing and talking loudly. Music was thumping from inside the house, so loud I could feel the bass vibrating through the air, even from when I was sitting in my car. What the hell? I muttered to myself. I ended up parking 2 blocks away and walking back to the house. As I got closer, the scene became clearer. There was a full-blown party happening in the house. I hadn't heard a word about it either. People were standing around on the porch, beers in hand, while others leaned against the cars in the driveway, smoking and laughing. I could hear the music louder now, blasting from inside, mingled with the sounds of shouting and laughter. I stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, trying to wrap my head around what I was actually looking at. There had to be at least 50 people in and around the house. My stomach twisted with this sick sense of dread. Something's wrong. This wasn't Reese, and this is not his usual style. I hadn't been told a thing about any party. I pushed my way through the crowd and onto the porch, ignoring the sideways glances from people that I didn't recognize. The moment I stepped inside, the noise hit me full force. The living room was packed with people, every surface covered in empty beer bottles and red Solo cups. Someone had plugged their phone into the speakers, blasting music so loud I could barely hear myself think. The house was trashed. Drinks had been spilled all over the floor, carpet stained, and the furniture pushed aside to make room for people to dance. I just stood there in the doorway for a moment, feeling a rising sense of panic. What the hell is going on? I moved through the house trying to find him. He wasn't in the living room or the kitchen, where a group of people were playing beer pong on the dining table. I finally found him in the backyard, leaning against the grill with a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He was completely out of it, eyes half closed, swaying slightly as he stood there, staring blankly at the flames. "Reese!" I shouted over the noise, making my way over toward him. Dude, what the hell is going on? He blinked and looked up at me with these bleary eyes. Party, man, he slurred, lifting the bottle of whiskey as if it explained everything. I just stared at him. A party? There's 50 people here, dude. You didn't say anything to me about this. Reese just shrugged and took another swig of whiskey. Didn't think I needed to. Before I could respond, two guys I didn't recognize came up behind us. They were big, both of them towering over me. Kind of muscles you only get from spending every waking hour inside the gym. One of them glanced at me and then turned to Reese. Everything cool here? He asked, his voice low and smooth, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. I tensed up, heart pounding in my chest. No, everything's not cool. This is my house too, and I didn't agree to this party. The second guy, the bigger of the two, stepped forward, his expression hardening. Reese's name is on the lease too, right? If he says it's cool, it's cool. You got a problem with that? My hands were shaking and I could feel the anger boiling up inside of me, but I knew better than to just let it out in the moment. These guys weren't here to party. They were here to intimidate. And if I pushed back, it could get ugly. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to just back down. No problem, I muttered. Turned away before things could escalate any further. I spent the rest of the night in my room, door locked, listening to the chaos outside. The music, the shouting, the sounds of bottles smashing against the floor. It all blended together into a cacophony of noise that just made my skin crawl. I barely slept. How could I? My house, or I guess our house, was being destroyed right beneath my feet. There's nothing I could do about it. By the time the sun was up, the house was a complete wreck. I walked downstairs bleary-eyed and exhausted. Furniture was overturned, beer soaked into the carpets. A few of our more expensive things were missing, stolen, no doubt, by some of these partygoers. Reese was passed out on the couch snoring loudly, completely oblivious to the destruction around him. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the mess. The anger I felt the night before had faded, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of defeat. I couldn't stay here, not after this. Reese had changed. He was not the same guy that I grew up with. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just the partying. There was something deeper going on, something that I didn't quite fully understand. But I was not about to stick around and find out anymore. The next week, I started looking for a new place to live. I didn't even tell Reese. Just packed up my things and left, leaving the key on the kitchen counter. And I never saw him again after that either. A couple of summers back, Kelsey and I were practically inseparable. We spent nearly every weekend together, sometimes even midweek if one of us could sneak out of work or skip a class. She lived inside this tiny apartment on the other side of town where everything cool happened. Restaurants, the bars, even a few of the nightclubs that didn't always check IDs. We were only 20 at the time, so the trouble we could get into was pretty limited. But we made the most of it. Kelsey's place quickly became our sanctuary. A little hideaway where we could pregame before heading out, have a few drinks, and then come back and crash on the couch, watching some stupid movie until we both passed out. It was really the time of my life. I don't think I ever felt so free. There's just something magical about those late nights in the summer, where the heat lingered well into the evening. The air felt thick with possibilities. We'd wander throughout the streets, laughing, sometimes stumbling a bit from the pre-drinks, but always in a bubble of our own making. Kelsey just had this magnetic energy. She could literally talk to anybody, make any situation feel like the start of an adventure. I think that's really why I gravitated toward her so much. She made me feel alive. That's when Shad came along, though. It started off innocent enough. Kelsey met him at a bar one night, and the three of us clicked instantly. He was just one of those guys who seemed like he could keep up with us. Always ready for a good time. Always down to drink and laugh until the early hours of the morning. He was tall with a shaved head and a tattoo crawling up his neck that just gave him this edge that Kelsey seemed to love. At first, I really didn't mind him tagging along. The more the merrier, right? He made us laugh. He knew all the good bars. He was always the one suggesting one last shot or one more round. He also wasn't broke, which was a good sign. No mooches allowed. After a while, I started to notice something about him, though. He didn't really seem to have an off switch. We all like to drink and get drunk, sure, but Shad, he went further, always. He'd get to the point where he was just a little too sloppy, a little too loud, then something in his eyes would just change. It was subtle at first, just a glance that lingered too long, or maybe the way he'd slur his words, getting way too close to me or Kelsey. We'd all laugh it off. I mean, it was just Shad. He was Kelsey's boyfriend after all. I didn't want to seem like I was being uptight. Then, of course, the inevitable happened. He moved in with her. It was supposed to be temporary, or at least that's what Kelsey said. Something about his lease being up and him needing a place to crash for a few weeks while I figured it all out. I immediately didn't buy it. I could just tell from the way he was already talking about making changes to the apartment itself. He had no plans on leaving anytime soon. But it was not my place, so I couldn't say anything. Kelsey seemed happy, and who was I to burst that bubble? Things really didn't change that much at first. The three of us still went out, still got drunk, and still stumbled back to the apartment, crashed on the floor or just in a tangle of pillows and blankets. Shad's presence just began to get heavier. He was always there, always hovering just a little too close. And when Kelsey wasn't around, I noticed he would start to watch me in this way that made my skin crawl. I shrugged it off, convinced myself I'm the one being paranoid. He's Kelsey's boyfriend. He wouldn't do anything weird, right? And then that night came. We'd all gone out, per usual. Kelsey, Shad, and I pre-gamed at her place. Hit a couple of bars, doing our usual rounds. Kelsey was in a great mood, laughing and flirting with Shad, and I was just trying to keep up with them. We got pretty drunk, but nothing out of the ordinary. After a few hours, we decided it was time to head back to Kelsey's place, figuring we'd just chill out and watch a movie or something before I would make my way home. I wasn't planning on staying over that night. When we got back to her apartment, Kelsey was the first to crash. She just passed out on the couch, mid-sentence, her head lolling back as she fell into a deep sleep. I remember laughing, thinking how typical it was for her to tap out early after a night of drinking. Shad and I were still buzzing though, not ready for the night to end just yet. You want another drink? He asked me. I hesitated, but then I thought, well, why not? I was still feeling pretty good. I figured one more wouldn't hurt me. I nodded. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a couple of beers and 2 shots. We toasted, down the shots, and then I settled back on the couch to finish watching the movie. I don't remember falling asleep. One minute I was watching the screen, and then the next, darkness. When I woke up, it was to this strange prickling sensation. Something was off. My head was foggy, my mouth was dry, and for a second, I didn't remember where I was. And then I heard this soft shuffling sound, like somebody moving around in the dark. I blinked and my eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light from the TV, and that's when I saw Shad. He was crouched at the end of the couch, face inches away from my feet. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming, still half asleep and my mind was playing some kind of trick on me. But then I saw it, his phone. He was holding it up and snapping pictures of my feet. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The hell is this guy doing? I wanted to scream, to kick at him, but my body was sluggish, like I was trapped in some kind of molasses. I tried to sit up, but before I could move, I saw him lower the phone and then he leaned in. His tongue darted out and he licked the tip of my toes. I jerked back, finally breaking free of the paralysis that had completely gripped me. "The hell are you doing?" I shouted at him. Shad jumped back, eyes wide, like a kid caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Whoa. Relax, he stammered out, holding up his hands. It's not a big deal. It's nothing. Don't freak out. Not a big deal? I was on my feet now, body trembling with adrenaline. You were taking pictures of me and then licking my feet, you fucking freak. He stood up, towering over me, his face a mix of embarrassment and anger. I wasn't doing anything. You're overreacting. Just sit down, okay? I didn't mean anything by it. But I couldn't stay there. I couldn't be in the same room as him for another second. I grabbed my purse and bolted for the door, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the lock undone. Chad was still behind me, muttering something, trying to calm me down, but I was done listening. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I fumbled for my phone and called an Uber, not trusting myself to walk home alone in the dark. My heart was still racing, skin crawling with the memory of what had just taken place. The next morning I called Kelsey, and I didn't want to tell her over the phone, but I couldn't wait either. She needed to know what her boyfriend was really like. When I finally told her, there was this long pause on the other end of the line. Kelsey? I prompted, stomach twisting in knots. I don't know what to say, she finally replied, her voice small and shaky. I mean, that's disgusting, but I'm not totally surprised. What the hell do you mean? I asked. She hesitated before continuing. He's done stuff like that to me before. I've woken up to him touching me in my sleep. I caught him taking pictures of me once. He said it was just a joke and didn't think much of it. I thought maybe I was just overreacting. Kelsey, you have to break up with him. That's not normal. He's a fucking creep. She agreed. The next day, Shad was gone. He didn't take the breakup well, but eventually he left us alone. Kelsey and I went back to hanging out, just the two of us. We never spoke about Shad again. We made a pact after that to steer clear of any guys who gave us even the slightest weird vibe. Sometimes late at night though, when I'm lying in bed, I still feel that cold, wet sensation on my toes, along with the memory of Shad's face, illuminated by the glow of his phone. And no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that he's taking advantage of some other poor girl out there now.